I don't think I need to go into too much detail about the impact and acclaim that comes associated with Team Japan. The in-house Sony company, formed with the idea of finding burgeoning creatives to create a catalogue of exclusives for the PlayStation, saw from its founding in 1993 the creation of some memorable games for the console at the time, some cult classic beloved franchises many would love to see return, as well as some of the great classics of video game history. Likewise, I don't think I need to go into too much detail about how the PlayStation 3 and 4 era damaged the company's perception in their parent company's eye, and how Sony's obsession with massive big budget games and their ignoring of the concept of the mid-range game, which of course was the reason why the PS2 is still the best selling console of all time and one of the most revered, led to the breaking up of Team Japan, with Team Asobi now being the only remnant left, who of course have since created a very fun and well designed game which showcases the abilities of the PlayStation 5, serves as a great nod to the company's history, and has given Sony a new and cute little mascot. All through the medium of playing as a young robot that smacks things. And of course, we now have Astrobot coming up, which allows me to turn my negativity around and be positive for the rest of the video. Mostly. I love Gravity Rush 1. It sits easily as one of my top 10 favorite games of all time. Originally released as part of the PS Vita's launch window, it would go on to sell 200,000 copies after 6 months of release. It would then be one of the chosen few Vita games to get a port to the PS4 via Gravity Rush Remastered, where this new larger base and platform would see it sell worse. But I am extremely grateful for this port, since it was the means by which I discovered the game. Okay, well, I actually discovered it by playing the demo for the sequel, but regardless, I wasn't going to become aware of it just by the Vita version. Now, I do have a bit of a theory as to why the remaster didn't do as well as the original, despite now having that larger player base. And part of that theory is one of the reasons that I find the game so enjoyable. So, indulge me as I set up the basis before divulging into that further, starting with the worst aspect of the game. So, I realize that it isn't the best argument in my favor when I start off my "I really like this thing" video by ragging on it. But there is a method to the madness here. Firstly, by starting with the most negative part, I can get more positive as we move along. And secondly, I think it actually does go some way to highlighting and reinforcing the good parts of the game. And no, it doesn't have anything to do with the fact that I always just talk about this first. Anyway, before I do get into the combat, I do have to very quickly touch on the game's core gimmick, since it does play a part. Our character Cat has the ability to shift gravity. With one push of R1, you leave contact with the surface and enter a weightless floating state. From there on, you can orient your view and press R1 to move to another surface and initiate that as your new center of gravity. Also being able to halt and stay floating in mid-air if you wish. That is a very simplistic breakdown, but we will talk more about that later. For now, it is combat time, and as I said, it is the worst part. Not that it's terrible, it's just basically serviceable and nothing more. Cat can kick enemies with square, with you being able to chain more kicks together as you upgrade. You can then also use R2 to dodge, with its effectiveness also being improved with upgrades. And that's basically all there is when it comes down to ground-based combat. And when you are on the ground, it really is just mostly mashing square. The enemies have glowing spots, which are the only places where they take damage. So you think that would imply you need to be a bit more precise and targeted with your attacks? But no, mashing will do you just fine. Though it's not such a problem, because mostly you won't be fighting on the ground. As you will quickly discover, it's best to go aerial. There isn't too much you can do offensively in the air, but the one thing you can do basically negates everything else. When you have ascended, you can target enemies and press square to dive kick into them. And if we learned anything from Tifa, dive kicks are fun and ridiculously powerful. Once you have come to understand the power of the dive kick, it will be your go-to method, especially once it's been upgraded, and you've given yourself enough stamina to just stay in the air for pretty much the length of any battle. Though you will still have to get used to the occasional occurrence of Though I have to say, it is a bit of a shame that you can reduce this aspect of the combat to this, because going aerial is the more interesting part of it. When you are fighting bosses and more powerful enemies, you have to actually move Cat around and orient her in the right position to be able to attack. And so it does actually make it a bit more strategic and thoughtful. Unfortunately though, this is compromised by one flaw. When you are aerial, you are a sitting duck. Now, I don't mind you needing to react quickly to attacks while you're planning your offense. But what this requires is that you can react quickly to attacks. The aerial dodge you have is pretty unwieldy and slow, not actually really giving you much opportunity to react unless you literally see the thing coming. And then when you get hit, it can disorient you quite a bit, and then you can run out of stamina, and if you're fighting in an open area, actually fall out of the battle arena. You also have the ability to throw objects with circle, and it's fine I guess. Its main problem is that, like the dodging, it's a bit too sluggish and slow. You press circle once to activate the stasis field, which will then pick up nearby objects. Well, hopefully it does. Sometimes they start to lift up, but then they decide they just aren't interested and run off. But once you finally have picked up some objects, you can then throw them. And as I said, it's a bit too slow. Especially since creating the stasis field causes Cat to start hovering, which means if you want to stand on the ground for your chucking of projectiles, you will first need to ground yourself. Which you most likely will want to do, given that aforementioned lack of maneuverability in the air, and the fact that getting hit means you drop the object. This, coupled with the fact that there isn't always objects to throw around, means you should just stick to your gravity kick of infinite smite. Lastly, we have the special attacks. When this little ball in Cat's health bar is there, you can activate one of 3 special attacks, after you've unlocked them of course. And in contrast to standard combat, this is the situation where you should go all out with throwing. The first one is the Cat Claw, activated by pushing triangle, in which Cat launches herself and homes in on all targets. Which is good, but in more constrained areas with a fair amount of obstacles, Cat can easily get stuck headbutting rocks. Also, if the enemies are spaced quite far apart, the attack might not end up reaching all of them. The last one is the micro black hole, activated by pushing down and triangle, where Cat creates a mini black hole around herself, which damages anything it touches. Unfortunately, it suffers from the same issue as the claw, that if the enemies are too far apart, it is pretty ineffective. You can control Cat's movement while doing it, which does mitigate that a bit, but she moves a bit too slowly for it to be enough compensation. And this is why the second special attack, the Gravity Typhoon, is the best. Activated with up and triangle, Cat generates a series of large rocks, which she then throws at all enemies on the screen. They do a lot of damage and home in onto its targets, so all you need to do is shift yourself out enough so that you have a full view of the battlefield, and then you just let loose. So, that's the combat, and it's perfectly serviceable. I don't think it's bad, but battles do just feel like too much of a formality than anything else. Combat feels like it's there because it's obliged to be, since we are playing a video game. But then given enough attention so that it's not so superficial and therefore doesn't feel like an obligation. But it is functional and more than good enough because it's held up by the other part of gameplay. The act of shifting is just so enjoyable. On all my playthroughs, I have added a fair chunk of hours just because I have so much fun flying around the city. Even on this playthrough now, which was intended to just be a quick run through to remind myself on aspects for the script, I couldn't stop myself from shifting with no objective. As said earlier, by pressing R1, Cat will lift from the surface she's currently on and hover just above it. You can then orient her with the right analog to press R1 again and fling her in a new direction, with whatever surface she lands on being the new center of gravity, from where you walk along it, as is normal for the original surface. For as long as you have stamina, of course. Though, it's actually pretty rare that you are going to stay on these surfaces. More often than not, you are going to shift gravity to get to a higher surface, or in some situations move down, at which point you can hold X to move faster, and upon arriving, press L1 to reset gravity to normal. And that is really the simplicity of the shifting. It is really easy to use, but really enjoyable. However, there are two little niggles. Sometimes when you shift quickly, you might get caught up on a pole or something. And it's also a bit annoying that if you want to change direction, you first have to stop and then turn and then press the button again. It would have been nice to have a Resident Evil style quick turn, but these are really minor annoyances. The mechanic is extremely easy to use, but also still does have a bit of a learning curve, where once you get more accustomed to it, you will find yourself being able to change direction almost seamlessly, and being able to squeeze yourself through tighter spots without clipping anything. But what is even more fun is the gravity slide. If you hold down the triggers, Cat will begin sliding across the surface. There's not too much else to say about it, but it really just feels so good. You can feel the pace at which she moves, and her drifting and movements are very responsive. If I was to highlight an issue with it, it would probably be that the jump while doing the sliding is a bit too floaty, but otherwise it's great. You can also attack pretty seamlessly with it, with Cat giving the equivalent of a gravity kick if you slide into an enemy and then are able to continue on your way afterwards. Kind of a shame that there weren't more situations created for it to be useful. However, it's all good and well to have good mechanics, but are they actually put to good use via the game design? Well, yes. The shifting is incorporated into almost every aspect of the game. I've already spoken about its use in combat, but it also aids it through another means. Dotted throughout the map are gems which can be collected and then used for upgrading Cat's abilities. So while the enjoyment of shifting and a natural desire to explore may get you moving around, you are also rewarded for doing so. But there's also a more direct push to use shifting. The story missions generally involve a lot of platforming, with some of them adding additional challenges, such as the gravity gauge being drained extremely quickly, or ones which require you to carry people around while avoiding enemies or obstacles. And there are even situations where you can't shift, to highlight what a miss it is when you don't have Dusty's powers. And there's also even a boss fight which requires you to avoid obstacles while shifting. And there are also side activities which make use of the shifting. There are various challenges sprinkled throughout which allow you to make use of different aspects of the gameplay. There's combat score attacks, which I think for obvious reasons given earlier, I enjoy the least. Combat score attacks where you can only get your points by throwing. Freestyle races where you must just beat the times through whatever means. Races where you must gravity slide. Races where you start with no stamina and so have to plot the best course where you can accumulate and be economical with its usage. Challenges where you have to ferry people around. And one where you have to throw objects into a specific area. And they are fun. And particularly the races can be very satisfying when you just beat those times. Unfortunately though, they are a bit of a victim to a scaling problem, in that they become too easy once you have upgraded a lot. The races aren't as negatively affected, since even if you do get faster and get more stamina, you still need to follow the correct path and hit the checkpoints. But the score attack gets very much nerfed. I literally had to stop and just stand still to let the time finish on the last one, because I got stuck in a loop where I kept defeating enough enemies to get more time added, so it would just never run out. And unfortunately, you can't just keep going until you lose your health, because if you do, you fail the challenge completely. But like I say, the races aren't as negatively affected, and the upgrading can be helpful if you're stuck on a challenge. I would say though, if you want the most feeling of actually needing to use skill and the most satisfaction and sense of achievement, do the challenges as soon as they become available, rather than leaving them to the end of the game. Which is also a good thing, since they do give you gems for completing them, so can help you with the story missions. Now mechanics are all good and well, and very well actually, and so are activities to make use of said mechanics. But when we are dealing with something like shifting of gravity, we bring another aspect into prominence. So let's get on to that. Unfortunately, given its importance, this one is a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, if you're going to be flying around, you would want there to be some interesting platforming or maneuvering required for that. And it is very well done out of missions. Heskerville, the town of the game, has a lot of verticality, giving you a good number of opportunities to get aerial. But not just by going up. There is a fair bit of twists and turns and outcroppings beneath the city sectors, which allow you to do some gravity delving as well. But it's not just verticality in terms of tall buildings. The districts have different layers, which you can easily move between, even without needing to shift. And it's not just vertically, the city has quite a few twists and turns to make gravity sliding fun as well. I think the fact that they were able to make the race challenges based in the city rather than needing to make separate courses is a pretty good indication of that. I also appreciate the size of our overworld. I think it hits a pretty good sweet spot. You can cover districts pretty quickly, so it doesn't feel like a slog to explore, but they also aren't so small that there is no sense of discovery. The overall map is also segmented into districts, which makes that exploration easier. Helped even more by something we'll get onto shortly. Unfortunately though, I don't find this translating as well into the missions. Obviously, missions based in Heskerville are fine, but the world design outside of that is pretty bland. The Rift missions are mostly uninteresting, either being too bland and open, or just needing to do very short bursts of platforming. I mean, the world pillar is basically just falling with intermissions of moving through blank space. That being said though, the second Rift mission does provide a great platform for some fun gravity sliding. The world pillar also has some of that, but the segments are just too short to get the same level of enjoyment. And I found the Village of the Lost Children to be generally uninteresting. Lastly, we have the Vision Quest style missions, and I think they are very much helped by context. They are pretty weird and trippy, which made them a lot more interesting. Because if you strip that away, it's very simplistic. You aren't able to shift in these segments, so you have to do platforming the old-fashioned way. Which is fine, but then the platforming is very simply just climbing up platforms and then picking the right option to tilt you towards the endpoint. Though again, the last one is pretty cool with the rotating of the city and then transitioning into being able to shift. However, despite my more general negativity, the uninteresting nature of the mission design is not such a negative thanks to this point actually generates quite a bit of whiplash with how well it is done in some parts, but then not so much in others. Firstly, pacing in terms of gameplay. When it comes to upgrading, you can't just grind gems forever and have Cat fully upgraded by mission 4. There is a cap on how far you can upgrade, with that only being able to be done by progressing through the story. This helps to prevent Cat from being too overpowered early on, and so stopping it just from being boring. Again, do the challenges when they pop up. If you struggle straight away, then level up to the cap you have, and you generally won't have a problem. Though it will still require concentration. And you can actually feel the difference when upgrading, particularly with shifting related matters. At the beginning, Cat feels pretty weak. She can't shift for long, she moves pretty slowly, and it takes a long time for the gauge to refill. but later you shift for ages, move really fast, and can have your gauge refilled before you even touch the ground. Next, we have pacing in terms of mission length. The missions generally aren't very long, usually about 10 minutes or so, which helps in two ways. Firstly, it gives a nice pick up and play feeling, where you don't get that worry of, if I play this mission, will I be stuck doing something for ages before I can quit again? Which is great if you are in a position where you can only play in drips and drabs. Obviously, the more extremely story pertinent missions are longer, but that's just a few. But the shortness also assists with the aforementioned environment design, because even though you might not find it very interesting, you're moving through it pretty quickly, so it doesn't feel like a drag to play through them. Lastly, we have pacing with regards to exploration. This one is the more shaky aspect. It starts off well, but then declines as we continue. Initially, we only have access to Ulnor, which allows you a nice starting playpen to get accustomed to the controls and core gameplay. Then, after a few missions, you unlock Plejun, which is bigger with a more compact and twisty design to suit your improved, well hopefully improved, handling of the controls. All good and well, but this is when the problem then starts. After you finish with unlocking the whole of Plejun, there is no space for the finding of the next two districts. Like, within 3 to 5 missions, you've unlocked them all. There is one mission done in Industria before you go on to find Vendor Center. I get that Industria is very small, the smallest of the hub world, but there is definitely a feeling of things accelerating a bit too quickly. And it's not even like the game is running out of missions. There's still a lot of missions after you get Vendor Center. So you just don't get the same time to play around in the two new areas like the first two. Especially since after you unlock Vendor Center, it doesn't even place the new missions there until like the last one of the game. Though this is definitely not the worst thing, more just a bit bizarre than anything else. And speaking of a bit bizarre, I've seen before some criticism of Gravity Rush's story, that it is very disjointed and kind of just makes up events and fights on the fly. Now, I think part of this is the fault of the remastered edition. It included all the DLC missions into the game, which is normally fine, but not all of them are included in a logical sequence with the plot. Like, they just become available at an arbitrary point, which doesn't necessarily tie in well to the main story. Though, to be fair, one of them does. It also doesn't help though that they involve her taking random jobs which aren't very strongly related. She becomes a maid, a spy, and a fascist. Regardless of that though, the plot isn't that disjointed, though it is definitely composed of a lot of events just happening without there really seeming to be a thread or follow through which led to it, which can give a feeling of it being disjointed. Okay, before we continue, let me quickly say that I have played Gravity Rush 2, and so do know about the whole overarching plot. But in this video, I am specifically talking about Gravity Rush 1 as a game in isolation, free of anything else related to it. So, yes, Gravity Rush 1 is rather jumpy with regards to its plot, but I think that's actually a fun thing. It makes use of a number of aspects of picaresque narrative. Originally coined in 1810, but dating back to ancient Rome, with the Golden Ass by Apuleius believed to be one of the key originators, picaresque narrative revolves around a likable rogue, or picaro, and the trials and tribulations they face attempting to survive in an unfair society, quite often serving as a satire as well. And Gravity Rush features maybe not all, but a fair number of the facets of this type of narrative. In fact, let's look at which boxes it ticks. Here are the qualities for picaresque storytelling according to Thrall and Hibbard's A Handbook to Literature. Number 1. A picaresque narrative is usually written in first person as an autobiographical account. I think mostly yes over here. Cat often narrates as the game continues, even going so far as to foreshadow events that are to follow. Number 2. The main character is often of low character or social class. They get by with wits and rarely deign to hold a job. I think very much so over here. Cat definitely isn't of low character, but she starts out homeless and an unknown in the area. She needs to find a home in a sewage pipe, and from there mostly just reacts to events as they happen, jumping between employment as it suits her whims. Number 3. There is little or no plot. The story is told in a series of loosely connected adventures or episodes. We can put a tick over here. While there is more of a plot going on than may sometimes get credit, and again obviously with the sequel even more so, Gravity Rush 1 is mostly just Cat getting involved in scrapes that happen without warning. Number 4. There is little, if any, character development in the main character. Once a picaro, always a picaro. Their circumstances may change, but these rarely result in a change of heart. Definitely a tick over here. There is some initial piecing together of her character as she wakes up with amnesia, but on the whole, she stays the same person throughout. Number 5. The Picaro story is told with a plainness of language or realism. Okay, no, it's definitely not based in realism, though maybe something can be said for the plainness of language. Number 6. Satire is sometimes a prominent element. I would say this is much more of a feature in the sequel, but the first game does have some comments on authoritarianism, militarism, and class. Number 7. The behavior of a picaresque protagonist stops just short of criminality. Carefree or immoral rascality positions the picaresque hero as a sympathetic outsider, untouched by the false rules of society. Very much so. While it is not apt to describe Cat as a rogue or scoundrel, she has her own convictions and morality that she will abide to regardless of society. She is definitely a sympathetic outsider who will ignore the rules and manufactured morality of the society that she is in if she believes it to be harmful or unjust. So, I would say that we are ticking off a good majority of these points. But what is the relevance? What would be the positives of following this style of storytelling? Well, I would say there is one big one, and that is that there is no required adherence to a strictly logical flow, because the point is not to create a progression of intelligent happenings with a pretty much uninterrupted escalation in stakes. Rather, it's a series of mostly isolated escapades where our protagonist faces an obstacle and the tension is seeing how do they handle it this time. And as a result, you can insert events without too much concern of an intensely crafted and woven justification for it, nor does it have to coherently flow into the next episode or event. This results in you being able to do more outlandish and strange things, like Kat finding a door in the city which leads her into a strange realm to embark on a vision quest, or just happening to meet one of the world's creators and then jumping into his stomach to enter the rift, or just waking up to find her cat randomly multiplying and then needing to run around a gravity-distorted city to catch all of them. Another benefit of this kind of no-strings approach is characterization. The isolated-ish nature of episodes and stories means that you can chop and change the characters as you need to. You can remove a character for a while and then bring them back without much fuss, as the plot of each episode is more focused on immediate matters rather than a grand narrative. It also means that you don't need to fret too much about character growth or arcs, as either they won't be seen enough to get time for an arc, or it's just not the goal to give arcs in the first place. But while we have these benefits, there are some requirements to make it successful, particularly in a gaming context. First, a solid and enjoyable gameplay loop, which we've covered, but also, very much so, yes, if you are going to abscond contained and tight narrative in favor of focusing on adventures more centered around your characters, you kind of need those characters to be engaging and enjoyable, I would say. Fortunately, Gravity Rush does do the job here. Obviously, with the episodic nature, the characters aren't very layered or complex, rather featuring a notable character trait that they put on display when given their turn. Now, of course, this is often a source of problems in longer, more narrative-heavy games, but we have a situation here where the lack of complexity the episodic nature creates, it then goes on to fix itself by the fact that we aren't subjected to the characters for too long periods. So, any possibility of characters becoming too tedious is cut short. Not that it would be such a great risk here, as the characters are pretty damn fun. There are only a handful of central characters who show up regularly enough to be considered focal, and even then, they are mostly present for short arcs rather than showing up on a reliable basis. Again, it's the great thing of this style of narrative where you can chop and change your characters depending on the situation. But if I was to list these focal characters, we would obviously have Kat and Dusty, then Sid, Alias, Raven, Cyania, Garde. This is the problem with text-based games. I don't know how to pronounce these things, and now I look like a dick. Yuri and Unica. I realize that Delinica is like the main bad guy at the end, but you don't really actually see him. Anyway, as I said, the characters are rather one note, but they are fun. Sid is lazy and quite happy to think of schemes for others to carry out and then take credit for it afterwards. Something which would actually normally make me despise him, but he has such a general positivity, and we don't deal with him enough for this leech-like behavior to become too annoying. Alias is that fun kind of nemesis for a fair portion of the game, being that sneering villain who just likes to gloat and think themselves very clever. Raven is one of the more complex characters, starting out seeming like an overly aggressive cow until we discover why she's actually like that. I will concede that Yuri is pretty uninteresting, just being a stern military dude, and Yunica does get a bit annoying with her continuously being stuck up and self-righteous about her duty. Though they are there to rep that aforementioned satire. But my favourite of the side characters are the creators, Gade and Cyania. I just like the approach taken with them. They are the creators of the universe, so obviously supposed to be very wise and powerful. But the writing isn't afraid to make fun of them, and make them look a little bit silly and flawed. Cyania spends most of her time asleep, and not even aware of what's going on. And Gade is actually lazy and quite crazy. Though, importantly, when the time comes, they both show how important they are and how powerful they are. This is a characterization trick I just really like. This dichotomy of powerful beings who still act human and can be flawed. But for all the greatness of these side characters, they are centered around and reliant upon one specific fulcrum. I just really love Kat as a character. She has such an infectious positivity about her. And I'm a massively miserable curmudgeon, which tells you just how infectious it must be. But she generally approaches all issues with an optimistic outlook, riding with the punches and adapting as needed. She also tends to want to do what is best for people and will inconvenience herself so that others can be happy. Though at the same time, she also has a very understandable and human trait where she does still seek validation and acclaim for what she does. But mostly, she's happy if others are happy. And she also has a good dynamic with Dusty, who, he mostly is just acting like a cat, but her continuous attempts to get his approval do provide some fun moments. And on that note, it's Kat's personality that amplifies the dynamics of all the other characters. Her willingness to help, enabling Sid's exploiting of others, her sense of justice and righteousness, making her a good foil for Alias, her own internal morality independent of society, contrasting with the military discipline of Yunica and Yuri, her adaptability, allowing her to roll with the weirdness of the creators. And that's all I have to say here, actually. I realized by making this a separate segment, I probably should have had more to say. But Kat's just great. That's the segment. Despite only making its appearance in 2012, the concept of Gravity Rush has been with us for a long time. Keiichiro Toyama actually already had the basic idea before the production of Silent Hill, which was back in 1999 for those unaware. However, his being shunted into making horror games meant this wasn't expanded on, as following the release of Silent Hill, his next project would be the Siren series. Until 2008, at which point he was given the go-ahead to begin working on Gravity Rush, or Gravity Days as it is actually named in Japan. Now of course, 2008 is a long way away from the Vita launch window of 2012, and that's because development actually started for the PS3. Because of this, the game was actually going to be of a larger scale, which then needed to be reworked almost entirely after the eventual confirmation that the Vita was going to be less powerful than the PS3. And I feel that this was both a negative and a positive for the game. The negatives being the resulting crunch and limited time to make the game ready for launch, which, despite the beliefs of absolute fucking idiots on the internet who view developers as their slaves to just make products at their whims, is not a good thing. But I also think being more constrained impacted the sales of the remaster in particular. I would imagine to some, the game would seem a bit insubstantial for something being on the mighty PS4. However, I do feel that these constraints were also a great positive, because it forces you to cut out things that are superfluous and focus on nailing a core mechanic. Something that I hope I have shown Gravity Rush does. As I have said, pretty much everything is based around making use of the gravity shifting mechanic. And this was something key and understood by Japan Studio and its associated teams as well. The games produced by those various teams had a core mechanic, which also tended to be a pretty creative one, and design was focused on exploiting that. Save for some minigames, Ape Escape's gadgets, platforming, levels are all geared around catching the monkeys. Shadow of the Colossus is designed for fighting the Colossi. Tokyo Jungle is something to do with Pomeranians murdering deer. I haven't played it. And this is something that I feel we have lost, particularly Sony themselves. The budgets of modern video games are just ridiculous, and this has led to not just overly long development times, but the creation of bloated games that have no respect for our time. Laced with superfluous things, which I concede may be fun, but also aren't really necessary, and wouldn't really make the game worse if they weren't there. And I'm not even saying I'm 100% opposed to the existence of big budget games. I mean, I'm a Final Fantasy fan, the poster child of massive budget games. But there used to be more tent poles. You would have a big budget game, but supplanted around this a good spread of mid-range games which had enough budget to be polished, but didn't need 1 million souls sacrificed and 72 years to be developed. But it's also created this weird paradox, where games take longer to develop, so invariably there should be less of them, but it also feels like there's too many games to play. Because they are too long, they take too much of your time, and so you end up feeling overloaded. And that's not even getting onto live service games designed to get you stuck on one of them for your entire life. And this is why the industry yearns for games like Gravity Rush. Games that know exactly what they are about and are willing to do something unique. I am cynically excited for Astrobot. I'm excited for a game developed with the mindset of Japan Studio, but sadly, I don't think it will lead to this rearrangement of priorities within Sony that some people hope of it. Because unfortunately, not just the industry, but a lot of the consumers have been conditioned into obsessing with big budget cinematic games. So it does seem like this train will be rode into destruction. So I feel the best we can do is highlight the gems that deserve it. If you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe. I've been put out a bit lately due to sickness and work, but I'm hoping to get some more stuff out a bit regularly again.